The rise of Chinese automakers across Europe and in the UK cannot be underestimated, and I actually quite like it because it's putting a bit more pressure on those traditional automakers to really step up their game. Step forward a brand called Jaecoo, which I'd never heard about before. In fact, it was established just in 2023 and it is a subdivision within Chery, that is the fourth largest automobile manufacturer in China. Now, at the time of filming, the 7, or also known as the J7 in certain markets, can be found as a full petrol vehicle or a plug-in hybrid. The petrol model is available as a front-wheel drive and an all-wheel drive, coming in at £29,500 and £32,500 respectively, while the SHS plug-in hybrid, which we have on review, can be found for £35,000. Now, in this video, which will be covered in such a format, I'll be seeing if it's actually worth its price tag and of course how it compares to some of its nearest competitors. So let's kick things off and talk about fuel efficiency. And here I am indeed in the SHS plug-in hybrid. That stands for Super Hybrid System. Now here you've got an 18.3 kilowatt hour battery pack that will supposedly give you 56 miles of pure EV range, but I wasn't able to see anything north of 35 to 40 miles, so I'm not really sure how that manufacturer got the claim. Now nonetheless, in terms of the MPG claim, this is also pretty ridiculous to say the least, because on the WLTP cycle it sits at over 400 MPG, while the petrol-only model sits at 35 to 37 MPG. Now realistically, from my own mixed driving test, which includes driving around the city, on the motorway and on the country roads, I netted a pretty respectable 50 to 55 MPG. Now, as you'll be able to see from the mileage leaderboard, it actually does fare pretty well. And specifically given the overall price tag of the Jaecoo 7, it actually performs far better than some of the more expensive alternatives out there on the market. Furthermore, if you're contemplating between the petrol and the hybrid model, certainly do consider the latter because it does give you that better fuel efficiency. Especially over here, if you can regularly plug it in, you're going to really bolster the overall MPG claim. And no, it's not going to get close to that 400 MPG claim by the manufacturer. Now, it's also great to see that you can also replenish its battery pack while you're on the move. Indeed, it has got self-charging capabilities. You can customize the behavior via the infotainment system, which can be handy, for example, when you're on the motorway, where a petrol powertrain will be a little bit more efficient, and therefore means that you can replenish its battery pack, and then when you get within the city, where it's a bit less efficient, you can actually utilize the EV portion, and therefore means that you can really bolster the overall fuel economy. Just bear in mind that if you're going to be self-charging, it's going to really decrease that overall fuel efficiency. Now, you have also got regenerative braking, and right now I'm on the medium mode, and if I were to lift off the accelerator pedal at roughly 30 miles an hour, the vehicle will slowly decelerate. If I go on the high mode, the vehicle will slightly decelerate a little bit more harshly. Now, while it can be appreciated, I do think that the high mode just feels a little bit of a step too far. Indeed, over here, the brakes feel just a little bit too grabby for my liking, so therefore each time I am going off the accelerator pedal, it feels like it's constantly jerking. However, on the medium mode or on the low mode, it just feels a little bit smoother. That is, of course, subjective, and you might have a little bit of a less heavy foot than myself. Now, you can also plug it in, and here it's fantastic to see that you have got 40 kilowatts of DC charging capabilities. Therefore meaning that if you do find an appropriate charge point, for example on the motorway or indeed within a public charge point, then you can go from 30 to 80% in a mere 40 minutes. It is a shame, however, that its Type 2 port is limited via its onboard charger, which is capped at 3.3 kilowatts. And therefore means that if you were to plug it into a wall box, like you'd find at work or indeed at home, going from 30 to 80% will take you 3 hours, while going from 0 to 100% will take you a whopping 6.5 hours. Now, it's also great to see that you have got vehicle-to-load charging capabilities, which effectively means that you can discharge the battery pack to another vehicle or, of course, more importantly, a household appliance, which is really useful, for example, if you go camping. Another very important factor for a lot of individuals will be driver comfort, and thankfully I'm pleased to report over here that the Jaecoo 7 is actually supremely comfortable. It's been tuned for those inner city drives, but actually does respond relatively well on those winding country routes. Sure enough, you'll get some body lean and you haven't got the best sort of one-to-one driver's input, even in terms of its sport mode preset, but I still think a lot of consumers will be left pretty surprised. Furthermore, when it comes to just pottering around town, you have got a MacPherson strut strut and coil spring setup at the front with a multi-link suspension and coil setup at the rear. The combination really does yield for a pretty pleasurable experience. You kind of glide over speed bumps and potholes, and the anomalies are soaked up while you're on the motorway. Frankly speaking, over here, in comparison to the vast majority of its competitors, namely at its price point, I don't think there's any sort of SUV that comes close in terms of the overall driving comfort. Now, it's a shame, however, that the SHS plug-in hybrid is available only as a front-wheel drive. I mentioned this because the petrol-only variant is also available as an all-wheel drive. Sure enough, this might be a little bit redundant for most individuals, but here potentially the all-wheel drive alternative of a plug-in hybrid might have been handy for certain individuals that really do need it. Nonetheless, I had no problems when it came to traction, although when it came to putting my foot down to the metal from a standstill, I did notice a little bit of wheel spin, but there was no sort of torque steer to worry about, so therefore the overall grip that I got while on the road was actually pretty good. Furthermore, the transition between pure EV power and petrol power was pretty much seamless. I didn't really notice it, other than of course when I was just putting my foot down and doing, like, let's say, an overtake maneuver on the motorway, did I notice that the engine was ramping out. It was actually very quiet and can very barely be heard from the front of the cabin, let alone at the back. In terms of the overall cabin insulation, it's done pretty well, and in fact I've got a breakdown of the cabin measurements on my dedicated audio review that you'll be able to find down on your description below, or indeed in the pinned comments. Now, this actually perfectly brings me on to performance, and I would just like to point out over here that it seems like the plug-in hybrid has got a single-speed gearbox, and therefore there's no means of actually adjusting the gears while you're on the fly, and it's indeed thanks to the electric motor. However, in the petrol models, you've got a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission, or DCT for short, and therefore means that you might be able to hear or indeed feel the gears a little bit more. In terms of raw performance, the SHS plug-in hybrid is the most powerful out of the lineup. It's got a 4-cylinder 1.5 litre turbocharged petrol engine at the front, and it combines it with its battery pack to output 150 kilowatts of power, or 201 horsepower, and 310 newton meters of torque. It's claimed to go from 0 to 62 miles an hour in 8.5 seconds. Whereas the petrol-only models have got the same 4-cylinder engine. However, it's a 1.6 litre turbocharged petrol engine, which will output 108 kilowatts of power, or 145 horsepower, and 275 newton meters of torque. These vehicles are claimed to go from 0 to 62 miles an hour in 10.3 to 11.8 seconds, depending on the trim that you go for. Now, I actually had the SHS plug-in hybrid tested using RaceLogic's Performance Box Touch from 0 to 20 miles an hour in 2.02 seconds, 0 to 30 miles an hour in 2.98 seconds, 0 to 60 miles an hour in just 7.35 seconds, so yes, faster than the manufacturer's claim, 50 to 70 miles an hour in 4.04 seconds, and I also recorded a peak acceleration of 0.52 G. There's also a top speed of 108 miles an hour, while the petrol models go a little bit further at 112 miles an hour. So next up we get onto its interior design, and it's not going to quite compete with more luxurious alternatives out there on the market, but frankly I actually do love what the manufacturer's been able to achieve. You've got a nice sort of contrasting design. This is namely due to the fact that you've got a different sort of material that wrap around the dashboard and the door trims, and then you've also got an LED strip that can be customized via the infotainment system. It's also nice to see that practicality has been retained in certain ways, whereby you've got physical buttons that are found on the steering wheel, and yes, they might look haptic and also touch sensitive buttons, but in fact they are actually fully physical buttons, and this is certainly appreciated because it means that you're not going to actually accidentally initiate them while you're on the move like you'd find on some rival alternatives. As for the center console, you've got a few physical buttons, namely for you to determine how the vehicle is operating, and then you have of course got the controls that are found via the infotainment system. Here in the entry-level petrol model, you've got a 13.2-inch portrait display. However, in the all-wheel drive and in the hybrid, this moves up to a 14.8-inch display, which is pictured. It is actually super responsive and it's very intuitively laid out. Therefore, it doesn't take long to actually get used to the infotainment system. It also supports Android Auto and Apple CarPlay over a wired and wireless format, which is certainly appreciated. However, I can say that within the infotainment system itself, via, for example, the driver assistance settings, sometimes the menus were actually going on and off just randomly, and this really just left me baffled to say the least. It could have been because I was disabling some of the settings while I was on the move, but nonetheless over here I just thought to share my own experiences. Speaking about the overall software glitches, I did also notice that when it came to locking the car, and if the retractable sunblind wasn't fully shut, it would actually beep really loudly. This was the only cause that I could find in terms of why the vehicle was beeping, because all the doors were closed, my mobile phone wasn't left in the car, my key fob was on me, and all the windows were closed, and therefore potentially the sunblind was kind of triggering that issue. Again, something I thought I should highlight, and maybe that's something that you should be aware about. Elsewhere, when it comes to actually driving the vehicle, you have got a gear selector, like you'd find, for example, on the older Tesla vehicles. This is actually quite intuitive to use. However, when it comes to going between drive and reverse, for example, if you're doing a 3-point turn, you have to fully depress the brake pedal before changing between drive or indeed reverse. Whereas in a lot of other cars, you can quickly go between drive and reverse. Here it takes an extra bit of second, and sometimes I was left in neutral. So for example, I was in drive and I was shifting up to go to reverse while somewhat depressing the brake pedal but not fully depressing it, and therefore it would go in neutral. I would then have to just press it a little bit harder and then go into reverse. Again, something that did kind of give me a little bit of a bugbear when it came to using the vehicle on a day-to-day basis, and something that you might come across if you actually own it. Now, aside from this, you've got a fully digitalized 10.25-inch instrument cluster, which is actually very bright and vivid, and also does get pretty dim as well in those night drives. It is also somewhat customizable with different menus. Now, as an extension to this, you've also got a projected head-up display, which is present in the all-wheel drive petrol and the hybrid model. This will give you your driver assistance systems and the traversing speed, and therefore allows you to keep your eyes planted on the road. Now, in these trims, you'll also find an upgraded audio system, which goes from the standard 6-speaker setup to a Sony branded 8-speaker configuration. It does actually perform pretty well across the sound frequency range, and left me pretty impressed despite the lower number of audio drivers that are found within the cabin for a relatively larger size vehicle. In fact, if you want a detailed breakdown of the audio system, make sure you check out my dedicated audio review that can be found up on your pop-up banner, or by following the links down the description below or the pinned comments. Now, another thing which I actually quite like about the Jaecoo 7 is the amount of storage that you've got within the cabin. First off, you've got the glove box, which has actually been optimized for right-hand drive vehicles, and just beside it there's a small little hook, which is actually quite a novelty, useful for example if you've got shopping bags. Then towards the center console at the top of it, you have got a wireless charger, and this is actually a 50-watt wireless charger, so yes, pretty rapid. You've also got cooling capabilities just below it. Then you've also got another area where you can place a smartphone, although you have not got any sort of wireless charging capabilities. Further down, you've got 2 cup holders, and then you have got a cooled center armrest area, which has got a bifolding design. It's actually pretty large, and also has got a non-slip material at the bottom of it, which is very much appreciated. Underneath the center console, you've got a larger area with a non-slip material yet again, useful for example if you're going to be plugging your phone to Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, and therefore placing the smartphone safely over here, and therefore it's not going to be wobbling about. Equally, for example, for your loose change or keys, it's very much appreciated. Here you'll also find a USB Type-A port and a Type-C port, the latter which is used for charging only, and a 12-volt socket. You'll also find a USB Type-A and Type-C port at the rear of the center console for the second row occupants. Now, as for the door bins, the front 2 are actually pretty large and will easily accommodate a 500ml bottle alongside some small to medium-sized valuables. However, the rear 2 are a little bit more limited, which is no surprise. It's unfortunate over here that the door bins are not lined in any sort of fabric material. Now, you do actually have the ability of expanding storage, and by that I mean pulling down the armrest compartment at the back, which will also reveal 2 cup holders, useful for those longer distance drives. Now, of course, you do also have its boot, and here in the plug-in hybrid model, you've got 412 litres to play around with, or 1,335 litres when you drop down the seats. Not exactly class leading, and it is below the regular petrol model that offers 500 litres and 1,423 litres respectively. Nonetheless, here I still do think that the plug-in hybrid model will certainly suffice for the vast majority of consumers just doing their weekly shops. And it's also pretty practical. You've got a hatchback design that opens up pretty wide. You've got an electric tailgate that comes fitted as standard across the entire trim range. You then have a removable and retractable boot load cover, which unfortunately does not fit in the underfloor compartment. However, over here you will find some additional storage, for example, for your tyre repair kit. And then you've also got a flat loading bay with 60/40 rear split folding seats. Here, when it comes to practicality, it's actually really good, and therefore means that you can take elongated and larger sized luggage without any sort of worries. Speaking of which, rear occupancy space is actually fantastic. As someone who's just under 6 foot, I had no issues when it came to headroom or legroom. It's also great to see that the manufacturer has actually optimized a rear footwell design, keeping it pretty much near on flat, therefore making the legroom further optimized even for the rear middle occupant. Now, the seats themselves are all very accommodating and soft, and I had no sort of lower back pain when it came to doing my drive tests. And yes, the seats actually feel relatively premium as well, despite using the synthetic leather material. Now, the front 2 seats are heated as standard, which is very much appreciated. You've also got 6-way electronic controls for the driver and 4-way controls for the passenger. Yes, unlike some of its competitors that offer only manual controls or indeed an option to get electronically operated controls, it's great to see this featured as standard across the entire trim range. Now, you have also got ventilated front seats with an easy entry function with lumbar support for the driver within the luxury trims. And yes, that also includes the plug-in hybrids. Furthermore, you'll have a heated steering wheel and rear outer heated seats in the higher spec models. Now, similarly, I absolutely love the fact that you have got a pretty large 1.1 meter long panoramic glass sunroof, and it also has got a tilting and retractable function for the front. This is actually really nice to see because it is often an additional option with more premium offerings, or indeed just not offered altogether in cheaper alternatives. In this respect, it means it draws in some nice light within the cabin, and a retractable sunshade, which is also electronic, also adds a little bit of extra class and gives you the ability of blocking out those sun rays in case it actually is a very hot day. So moving swiftly on, we get onto its exterior design. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below. Subjectively, I actually do think it has got a really nice stance on the road, despite its pretty oversized frontal grille, because it's actually quite fitting with the robust kind of feel that the manufacturer is going for. You've got the headlights, which are relatively thin and feed seamlessly with the curved front bumper. Then towards the side, you have got these pop-up door handles, which add the kind of extra bit of class, something like you'd find on a Range Rover. And indeed, it does look a little bit sleeker while you're on the road. And you've also got 19-inch alloys that come fitted as standard across the entire trim range. At the rear, you've got a really nice sort of snazzy feel to it, with a sporty flair thanks to the included spoiler. Frankly, when it comes to its exterior design, I think it kind of stands out over some rival alternatives, but also very much looks the part. On that note, it brings me on to safety, and here it scored 5 out of 5 stars on Euro NCAP's crash tests, scoring 81% in adult occupancy, 80% in child occupancy, and 80% in its safety assist scores. Now, in terms of the driver assistance systems, they come included all as standard across the entire trim range, and there is an absolute boatload of them. Brace yourselves. Emergency brake system, including autonomous emergency braking, electronic brake force distribution, speed limiter, lane departure prevention, lane departure warning, forward collision departure warning, emergency lane keeping, multiple collision defense system, front collision warning, lane controlled assist, traffic jam avoidance assistance, traffic sign recognition, intelligent speed assist, door opening warning, corner speed control assist, blind spot detection, driving monitoring system, integrated cruise control, and adaptive cruise control. So yes, indeed, you've got an extensive list of driver assistance systems that come fitted as standard, which is very much appreciated because it will hopefully keep you safer on the road. With that said, I did find that in certain instances, it was a little bit counterintuitive. For example, the lane departure avoidance and the steering supports that you get were often veering me towards the left-hand side of the lane rather than keeping me at the center. As a result, I was constantly fighting the steering wheel, and because it's got a little bit of force feedback, it felt like I was just fighting it back and forth. As a result, I just had to disable the steering support and also the lane avoidance system. However, it is worth mentioning that some of the systems will become re-enabled every single time you power on the vehicle, which can feel a little bit annoying. Thankfully, the manufacturer has thought about it, and you've got a drop-down menu that you can swipe at the top right-hand side of the screen to disable some of these systems. For example, the driver alert system, which was a little bit oversensitive, and the lane departure avoidance, and also the speed limit warning, which was often quite wrong. In other words, saying that I was in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, when in reality I was on the country lanes doing 60. This means that the vehicle will be constantly binging and bonging at you, of course, unless you disable the option, which I'd highly suggest doing every single time you power on the vehicle. It's a shame that the manufacturer has not thought of including any sort of dedicated controls on the steering wheel or sort of shortcuts, which would have made it a little bit better when it came to using it on a day-to-day basis. Now, aside from that, you have also got rear cross traffic braking and an alert system, which can be handy, for example, when you're reversing out of a parking space and you might have not seen oncoming traffic. This actually uses the system's cameras and also sensors to detect any sort of objects, which is very much appreciated. This does actually bring me on to parking the vehicle, and it's actually very easy to maneuver. Despite its somewhat chunky size, the steering wheel feels very light and therefore makes it very intuitive to do, let's say, a 3-point turn or indeed maneuver in a tight parking space. You have also got fantastic visibility at the front and at the side thanks to these really wide opening windows. However, it is worth mentioning at the rear it can be a little bit more limited despite the pretty large window that the manufacturer has included. Thankfully, you have got front and rear parking sensors that come included as standard, and a 540-degree panoramic camera system, which also has got a high resolution, therefore giving you good peace of mind of not only towards the front, rear and the side, but also even underneath when it comes to giving you that sort of transparent view, useful, for example, if you're going to be taking the vehicle off-roading. So with all of that in mind, it brings us on to our verdict of the Jaecoo 7, also known as a J7 in certain markets. And quite honestly, I've been left absolutely outstanding at what the manufacturer's been able to achieve. So you've got a pretty rugged exterior and interior design, plenty good use of technology, and sure enough, the driver assistance systems can be a little bit annoying, but you've got an absolute plethora of them that come featured as standard. You've got good amount of rear occupancy space, good comfortable seats, and also a pretty spacious boot. Then you've got decent fuel economy and a very comfortable driving experience. Combining all of this at a very competitive price, it makes the Jaecoo 7 an absolute no-brainer, and as a result it gets our Best Buy award. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of this SUV down in the comment section below, and if you'd pick it over some rival alternatives, including one of the vehicles that you'd find from the traditional automakers per se. Now, if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.